The US LBM Preseason Coaches Poll is out this week, and a historic 9 teams from the SEC are ranked in the top 25. In fact, all 9 of those teams are ranked inside the top 20 of this preseason coaches poll. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. John, as we look at this poll, it confirms that what we knew all along, the conference got stronger with the addition of Texas and Oklahoma. Both of those two teams are ranked inside the top 20. Texas at number 4, Oklahoma at number 16. So it made what was already the most rugged conference in the land even more of a minefield. 9 teams overall are ranked. We'll get the rundown here in just a moment. But as you look at this, John, with Georgia number 1, all the way down to the number 9 team in the SEC, Texas A&M at number 20. What's just your general impression here of this overview of the rankings with 9 SEC teams in it?
My first impression was that the coaches just copied the preseason football magazines I read. Lindy's preseason magazine is almost a duplicate of this. I mean, again, 9 teams all in the top 20. So coaches had one of their underlings say, hey, who should we pick? They asked the coach, and the coach says, well, just get a preseason magazine and put what they did. And it all works out. So, but I wasn't surprised by it. I think most people, when you look at this, you'd come to the same conclusion. These are all pretty good teams. And one of the things that there's some teams that maybe you look at as not having quite as much talent as some other teams in the SEC, but they have a more accommodating schedule. And so it kind of balances out. This could be an unusual year, even as strong as the SEC is, to have this many teams in the top 20. And they won't all stay there, but right now I think that's kind of unusual.
One thing that maybe surprised me mildly, John, is the number of first place votes that Georgia received. I'm not surprised Georgia is ranked number 1. I figured they would be, but they received 46 of the I believe it was 55 first place votes. So an overwhelming percentage, over 80% of the first place votes went to Georgia in this. Ohio State got 7 first place votes. Texas got 1 first place vote, and Michigan, the defending national champions, received 1 first place vote. I'm guessing that voter probably has a policy of just votes the defending national champion first in the following year's poll every year. But what do you think about that? The fact that Georgia not only is number 1, but is really kind of an overwhelming number 1 in this rankings, even though Georgia didn't make the college football playoff last year, was awfully close. I think you and I believe if you're going truly on 4 best teams in the land, they would have been in the field, but they lost that can't-lose game to Alabama in the SEC championship, and they didn't get in. But here they are with 46 of 55 first-place votes.
Yes, I thought Georgia not only in terms of talent and based on what they've done during the regular season, they were the best team, that they wouldn't have just made the playoff. I think they would have won the playoff. I think if you would have paired them against any of the other participants in the 14 playoff going into the game, Georgia would be favored. But it didn't beat Alabama, so it got knocked out. But I think this reflects how voters look at Georgia. I think people look at Georgia, not just voters, but look at Georgia as a preeminent program in college football now, the way they once did with Alabama. They don't judge it too harshly if it loses a number of players to the NFL, because it knows it's got more future NFL guys coming back and will step into those roles. I also think the fact that their quarterback returns, Carson Beck, who was a Heisman in the Heisman race last year, certainly proved himself in the clutch and overall with his stats. So I think that's a really big factor now. We know this is a quarterback-driven sport right now. And if you got a returning quarterback and you've got a program that's as solid as Georgia's is, I think people look at that as number one. I don't know how you did it, but when I voted in the AP poll in preseason, my poll was not, I wasn't basing on, certainly not on what happened the previous year. It was based on what I thought, how I thought the top 25 would be at the end of the year. That's what I was predicting. When I was predicting my number 1 through 10, I thought that would be the final top 10. And of course, I was usually wrong, but that was my thinking on it. I don't know that most people think of it that way. Do you?
I didn't vote that way, but like you, I didn't vote based on what happened last year, or I'm sure on the subconscious level that factors into your voting. But I didn't make my poll. Well, this team did such and such last year, so they'd have to be in the top five. The way I did it was, in years I voted for the AP, I almost saw it as like my preseason power rankings. I
Hmm.
I didn't try to predict the future. Like I didn't know, I didn't factor that much, say, schedule into account. I just said, went from the top and said like these are my best teams, and the chips will fall where they may. I'm not necessarily saying these will be the teams I'm picking for the playoff, but if I were to do power rankings, these these are the way I would rank, 1 through 25, the 25 best teams in the land, and so I kind of tried to put schedule aside because I didn't want that to factor into how I looked at the rankings of teams. Now, if we were doing a playoff projection, I would factor in the schedule, but just in terms of ranking the teams, I did mine more like a power rankings, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess I did I factored into the scheduling more. I would look at Team A and say, this is probably a better team than Team B, but Team B has an easier schedule. So, and I kind of went down the schedules and looked at games and said win, loss, whatever. And that's how I did mine. So I think, yeah, that's the thing about voting. And it's not just preseason. Thankfully, we do more about who does it on the field than who people think might be the best teams. There's no set criteria. They can give you a list of things. The AP always did guidelines to follow, but everybody's charting his own course here. Usually, when he's doing his rankings, he's got. And some people would always say, "We didn't do that, but this is my number one team." And until they lose, they're staying number one. They just would refuse to be flexible enough, even though other teams had accomplished more.
Let's look at just the top six of these rankings first, because there's four SEC teams in the top six. So it starts out with Georgia at number one, then it's Ohio State 2, Oregon 3, Texas 4, Alabama 5, and Ole Miss 6. As you look at the national championship race, John, I think you would, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would say that those SEC teams in the top six are national championship contenders. Yes? Do you consider the four SEC teams in the top six? Do you think those four are national championship contenders?
Yes.
Okay. How about the two from outside the SEC, Oregon and Ohio State? Do you see them as national championship contenders? And is there anyone not in that top six that you would add to the conversation of, okay, this team isn't ranked in the top six, but you would add them to the list of teams that could contend for national championship?
I think Ohio State and Oregon, I think of as national championship contenders. But I wonder about Ohio State's quarterback situation. I know they
Mm-hmm.
got Howard from Kansas State, and he's a good quarterback, but I don't know if he's national championship good. I look at Oregon. I really wonder how Oregon's going to click in the Big Ten. I if it were in the Pac-12, I'd say yeah, it's a very viable contender, and it's a contender in the Big Ten. I just, I don't know with all the travel and just a new set of opponents, how that's going to play out. So, in terms of talent, though, yeah, I would consider them both in the top contenders. When I look at who else would I consider outside the top? You're saying outside the top six.
Yeah, and I don't have any contenders outside the top 6, and I was curious whether you do. I think the national champion is going to come from the top 6 in this preseason rankings. You know, the playoff makes things so interesting as far as who's going to get in, who's going to not make it. I mean, if you're ranked in this preseason top 25 and you're a fan of that team, I think you feel like your team has a shot at making the playoff, even if you're, number 20 Texas A&M or number 21 Arizona. I mean, if you're a Texas A&M fan, I think you're thinking, hey, the Aggies are preseason number 20. They can go 10-2 and grab one of those at-large spots. If you're an Arizona fan, you're thinking, hey, they're preseason number 21. Why can't they contend for the Big 12 championship in their first year in the Big 12? But making the playoff is so different than reaching the end of the road and winning the national championship. And I draw the line after these top 6. I don't, Notre Dame's number 7. I don't think they're a national championship contender. Michigan's number 8. I think they're a little bit overrated in this poll anyway, given how much they lost from last season. I wouldn't even have them at number 8. I don't think they're a contender. And I run down the list, and I don't see another team that I think this team can win a national championship. I see a lot of teams that can contend for the playoffs, but I think for me, the national champion is going to come from those top 6, and I'm just wondering if there was someone outside that top 6 that you think could also contend for the national championship, because I don't.
Yeah, I kind of thought like you wanted me to find a team, so I
No.
was I was trying really hard, and I and just no, I'm going there and running the names through my head, and I just can't. I couldn't come up with one. You look at it, and you look at teams. There are all these teams. That's a very good distinction. Making the playoff and being a national title contender. We have so many more playoff contenders now than we did in the old 14 playoff, but we really don't have that many national championship contenders. It would take a program to raise its game than what it's been recently. Say a Penn State, for example. Penn State, uh, you know, we think of that as a 10-2 team, lose the big games in the Big Ten, and have a fairly comfortable schedule. Makes it a playoff contender, but unless it can raise its game, and I don't see that happening, so I wouldn't include Penn State. I don't think Florida State in the ACC is as good as last year. Clemson is still, I think of Clemson as operating on a different level than it did when it was winning national titles and competing for national titles. Oklahoma State, Arizona, Utah. No, I just can't. I don't see anybody. I mean, I wonder if could you make a bet on that? I wonder what the odds if you said, uh, in the national championship will be one of these teams, you probably couldn't get very good odds, could you?
Probably not. You might have to, bet 10,000 to win $100 or something like that. But if you could do that, there would be gambling addicts out there, I'm sure, that would
Sure.
be pounding that bet. So let's run through the 9 from the SEC. We've mentioned a few, but it's Georgia's number 1, Texas is number 4, Alabama is 5, Ole Miss is 6. And so we said those teams are national championship contenders. Behind those 4 from the SEC, you have Missouri at 11, LSU at 12, Tennessee at 15, Oklahoma at 16, and Texas A&M at number 20. I'm wondering, John, who do you have as being overrated from the SEC? And maybe you think that most of these rankings are fairly appropriate, but even if it's just a few spots, I'm wondering who you have as being a little overrated from the SEC. And then is there someone that you consider to be underrated? And that could be a team that's ranked that you think should be ranked higher, or an unranked team that you think should be in the top 25.
I don't see great disparity in what the rankings look like and what I think they should be. There are a few subtle differences. Ole Miss at number 6. I have Ole Miss higher than that. I put it second only to Georgia in the SEC. So
Okay.
I've got it ranked higher. Um, I look at these. I also think Tennessee is underrated, and I look at Tennessee though. Again, when I'm factoring in my top 10 or top 25, I'm including my schedule, so I'm looking at it differently than you. I like Tennessee's schedule. I could see a 10-2 Tennessee team very easily. I also think Alabama might be a little bit overrated, and that goes back to the schedule. Alabama has a tougher schedule. And when I look at those, when I look at Georgia, Georgia has a much tougher schedule than it did say last year. I'm talking about SEC. Uh, Texas has to play at Michigan, which is kind of tougher. And then I look at these SEC schools outside the top 10, like Missouri at number 11. Just based on what Missouri has coming back and stuff, I don't think it's number 11 team. I would say it's overrated. But when I factor in the schedule, I think no, it might even finish higher than that.
Okay, so you have Alabama as being slightly overrated at number 5, and Ole Miss and Tennessee as being slightly underrated. I would add one more to that conversation and see what you think of this. Maybe you disagree. I think Oklahoma at 16 is a little bit overrated. I would have Oklahoma in the preseason top 25. I think 16 is a little too high for them. I just think there's like an assumption that Jackson Arnold, the first year starting quarterback at Oklahoma, is going to step in there and that offense is going to be just fine. And I know he played in the bowl game. Oklahoma did not win that game, but and Jackson Arnold threw a few interceptions. But overall, Arnold played pretty well. But he could play pretty well and still not be Dylan Gabriel. You know, they lost Dylan Gabriel to Oklahoma in the offseason, and he was one of the best quarterbacks in the country last year and was behind that victory against Texas that really kind of made Oklahoma's season. Their season was pretty up and down if you take that Texas victory out of it. So I think there's a lot of people that are kind of undervaluing how much that loss of Dylan Gabriel might mean. I think Jackson Arnold could be a solid quarterback, but Gabriel was much better than just a solid quarterback. And also, Oklahoma lost its offensive coordinator, the architect behind that high-powered offense the last few years, Jeff Lebby. He left to become Mississippi State's coach. So I feel like Oklahoma is maybe being a touch overvalued at number 16 because offense had been their calling card the last couple years. And the fact that they have to change quarterbacks and change offensive coordinators, that leaves me thinking they're going to have to rely a little bit more on their defense, which the defense might be a little bit better, but I don't know that it's enough better to justify a number 16 ranking. So I would have the Sooners a few spots lower, probably down near that 2021 range. But other than that, I don't have a major disagreement with this top 25, at least as it pertains to the SEC teams.
I guess when you bring up, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, I think Oklahoma's overrated because I'm factoring in schedule. And of all the contenders, Oklahoma has the toughest schedule. Oklahoma could have a good team and go 7-5
I agree.
with that schedule and some really tough games on the road. They did not do the Sooners, did not give them a very attractive welcome mat coming into the SEC. It's kind of, I don't think there even was a mat. They just opened the door and boom, there they were, facing all these difficult opponents. Another factor about Oklahoma, it's got an all new offensive line. It had guys transfer. Now it's got some guys that could be pretty good in the offensive line. Sometimes that's one area where I think of as continuity kind of matters and guys uh, working together in unison type thing. So I probably devalue them for that. But I think they've got some really good skill players. I think Jackson Arnold will be really, really good. Um, and I think their defense is going to be significantly better. So if it weren't for the schedule, if they had Missouri's schedule, I'd probably have Oklahoma where Missouri is.
Hmm.
Uh, I just think that that's the main negative I see in Oklahoma. I think a really interesting game, an early season game, will be Tennessee at Oklahoma. Uh, that's gonna that's gonna be Oklahoma's first SEC game. So I think Memorial Stadium will be at its best for that game. And I mean, it's a really, if Tennessee wins that game, it's really in good shape going forward. If Oklahoma wins it, it's still got a long way to go, but I think you can take 7-5 off the table then and maybe think 8-4 is the floor for Oklahoma. So that, uh, but I think because when I look at another thing that impresses me about these rankings is that there are going to be so many SEC games that will influence the playoff field. Just all these. I look at Texas A&M. I think A&M is ranked about right in terms of based on what it has returning, what it's done. I know it's got Mike Elko and new coach. I think that'll be an upgrade because I think Jimbo retired when he took that job.
Yeah.
He just didn't clue the Aggies in on that decision. So I think A&M would be better. I, what I wonder about though with A&M is a positive. They've got all their tough games at home, and you know what a good environment that is for the home team there in College Station. That place is really loud. It's really large. Uh, A&M could be a surprise team. I wouldn't because of that schedule in another early season game, Notre Dame at Texas A&M. You know, I think Notre Dame's a little overrated, like you. But if Notre Dame wins that game, it certainly looks like a much better candidate for the playoffs.
Yeah, I think Texas A&M is my sleeper playoff team from the SEC, which is it's kind of a weird discussion because if you're ranked in the top 15, I don't know that you count as a sleeper playoff team. Like Tennessee's number 15, but yeah, I don't know that you can really count them as being a sleeper. I mean, if you're that close to being ranked in the preseason top 12, I don't think that counts as being a sleeper team. So, I think to be a sleeper playoff team, you'd have to be outside the preseason top 15, and there's only two teams ranked, Oklahoma and Texas A&M. And then I just think those unranked teams, I don't give any of those teams much shot at making the playoffs. So it's a pretty short conversation, I think, for preseason a sleeper playoff team from the SEC. But I do think it's Texas A&M because if the theory is that they were underachieving with Jimbo Fisher, well, then that means they might appropriately achieve with Mike Elko, which would be a markedly better team this year. And also, you mentioned the schedule. All four of their toughest games are at home: Notre Dame, Missouri, LSU, Texas. Those are their four toughest games. All of them will be at Kyle Field. So yeah, I think they're more of a playoff contender than Oklahoma is because of the differences in the schedule. Oklahoma has a much tougher schedule than what A&M is. So I would still have Oklahoma probably at the very end of my list of playoff contenders. I don't think I would totally boot them off the list. But if I were ranking the probability of teams making the playoff, I would certainly have the Aggies higher than the Sooners.
Blake, another thing I noticed about the SEC's 9 ranked teams, I look at those teams and I don't see anyone with a big problem at quarterback. You can make a case that all of these teams will be very good at that position. I mean, you'd have to get really picky to say otherwise. I mean, Texas A&M Connor Wigman was hurt. Connor Wigman was starting to play very well last season. He got hurt, so he's out, but he's got some abilities, a former 5-star. You look at Oklahoma, you mentioned Jackson Arnold was one of the top players in the 23 recruiting class. Tennessee has Nico Iamaleava. Uh, he's number 5 in the odds makers have him as number 5. Some do in the Heisman race. So LSU even though it lost a superstar in Jaden Daniels, Garrett Nussmeier, we've seen what he can do. The guy can really fling it. Missouri with Brady Cook, Ole Miss, Jackson Dart. You going down the line, all these teams are really good at quarterback. So to me, that gives now, if you don't have a quality quarterback, you can just say you're not making the playoffs. You can just eliminate that team. If you're unsure about your quarterback, forget about it. All these teams should feel pretty good about their quarterback.
That's a great point, John. And I think the depth of quarterback talent in the SEC is about its best it's ever been. I'm not saying this will be the best top end year for quarterbacks, because there were a few seasons where the SEC was just phenomenal with like the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks in the conference. But top to bottom, this might be the best depth of quarterback talent the SEC's ever had. And I do think that's a good line of separation between, are you a playoff contender from the SEC or are you not? Like, I look at a team like Auburn. If Auburn had a different, better quarterback, I think Auburn might be on my list of teams that are playoff contenders. But with Peyton Thorne, the veteran, returning as their quarterback, I mean, you could do worse than Peyton Thorne. You could also do a lot better than Peyton Thorne. And I think that, for me, removes Auburn from a team I would consider a playoff contender. But if they had, say, Auburn had Garrett Nussmeier as their quarterback, well, then I might look at Auburn differently. And, you don't even have to give them Carson Beck. I guess what I'm saying is, a quarterback that we think is kind of, middle of the pack of these playoff contenders, someone like Garrett Nussmeier, really good quarterback, but, we wouldn't value him as much as, say, a Carson Beck. But still, even with someone like Garrett Nussmeier, I think Auburn would be a playoff contender. But they don't have someone like that. And so I think that removes them from the consideration, where, to your point, I think all 9 of these teams that are ranked have a good enough quarterback to make the playoff. Let's expand the conversation, John, and get into some of these teams that are ranked highly outside the SEC, because I want to play. I believe it was the show Project Runway, John, that their quote was either you're in or you're out. I didn't really watch that show, but I saw some commercials for it, and I think that was the tagline of that show. So in any event, we're going to play Are They In or Are They Out, with the top 12 teams in these rankings. Now, this is a little bit tricky because, as we know, there's automatic bids for the 12-team playoff. 5 conferences will claim automatic bids. Most likely that means the 4 Power 4 conferences get an auto bid, and then the best group of 5 champion will get an auto bid. And so actually, all 12 of these teams ranked in the preseason top 12, not all of them can make the playoff, because there's no team from the Big 12 in the preseason top 12, and there's no group of 5 team in the preseason top 12. So a maximum of 10 of these teams in the top 12 could make the playoff. And of course, it's possible fewer than 10 do as well, but a maximum of 10 is all that can make it from this preseason top 12. So let's start from the top, just looking for an in or out here, John. Number 1, Georgia. Are they going to be in? Okay.
Yeah.
For sure. Ohio State.
In.
Oregon.
In.
Texas. First one you've had to think about here. The first 3 were automatic. You're thinking. I know you're thinking about that Texas schedule. I'm sure that's what's holding you up here.
Yes, it is. I'll go in.
In for Texas. Okay. Alabama.
I'll go out.
Out for Alabama. First one out. You thinking 9-3 for Alabama then?
Yeah, it's that's a tough call. I'm just I'm not sure about Alabama. I really like its offensive line, and I like Kalen DeBoer. The more I read about him, the more I like him. So that's a tough one. I'm kind of flipping a coin there.
Yeah, I'm changing the rules on you too. I said at first I was just asking for in and out. Now I'm asking you to justify it. All of a sudden, introducing new rules into the equation.
Yeah,
yeah.
I need to talk to an attorney.
Always have one present in this litigious society we live in these days.
Yes.
How about number 7, Notre Dame, in or out?
Out.
Okay, so you got you got room for the two extra teams we need. We'll see if you kick any other teams out beyond the minimum of two that you had to remove from the equation. Number 8, Michigan, in
Out.
or out? Michigan out.
Hmm.
Okay. How about number 9, Penn State?
Out.
Wow, you're just booting them out left and right. Okay, so 4 teams are out of the equation from the preseason top 9. Number 10, Florida State.
In.
Florida State in. Number 11, Missouri.
Out.
Missouri's out. And number 12, LSU.
Out.
LSU out. Okay, so you have this would be an interesting season if it plays out the way you have it here, because you have only 6 of the preseason top 12 making the playoff. Of course, in addition to those 6, you would have the Big 12 champion making it, and you would have a group of 5 team, the best team from the group of 5, making it. So that would give you 8 right there, and that leaves 4 extra teams to make the playoff. I know you mentioned earlier you're sort of looking at 10-2 as a possible landing spot for Tennessee. So I'm guessing you have Tennessee as one of your extra teams in the playoff, and that would leave 3 more spots, which could mean a second team from the Big 12, could mean one of these other SEC teams like a Texas A&M that we were talking about earlier, could mean a second team from the ACC or another Big Ten team that we've mentioned. You got sort of 3 wild card spots here, in addition to the 6 of the top 12 that you have in a Big 12 champion, a Group of 5 champion, and then you've added Tennessee to the conversation. If it plays out the way you mentioned it, boy, that would be a pretty entertaining season. I guess I'm a little more chalky than you are, and would have a few more of the preseason top 12 in the playoff. I would be out on Notre Dame, so there's one. I would be out on Missouri, there's 2. And I don't know. I kind of like these other preseason top 12 teams to make it. Penn State has a really favorable schedule, so I think I'm going in on Penn State. I'm waffling on Florida State, but I do think they'll win the ACC. Although I could see a few other teams doing it. So I would put Florida State in. I would put Penn State in. I would put Alabama back in. My outs would be Notre Dame, Missouri, and I'll add Michigan to that equation. Michigan's got some challenging games on their schedule. They have Texas in the non-conference. They have Ohio State. They have Southern Cal, and then a couple other kind of coin flip games on the schedule as well. They lost so much, especially from that offense last year. Their running back, Blake Corum, the quarterback, J.J. McCarthy, most of that offensive line, which really powered them throughout last season. So, even though we have Michigan in our minds as the defending national champion, as far as the Big Ten playoff contenders go, I think Michigan has the toughest schedule. They play Texas, they play Southern Cal, they play at Washington, they host Oregon, and they play at Ohio State. I think you can get to 3 losses there pretty easily for Michigan. They could lose to just take the 3 toughest of those teams, Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State, all ranked ahead of them in the poll. So I'm going to put Michigan on the outside of the equation as well. So I got 3 open spots. One would be claimed by the Big 12 champion. One would be claimed by the best group of 5 team. And then I have 1 wild card spot still remaining. And I don't know off the top of my head who I would allocate that final spot to.
I've been doing some math here and looking at it a little harder, so I want to change mine.
Okay.
I'm putting Alabama back in.
You've got Alabama back in.
Yeah, I think the SEC will have 5 teams, and Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Alabama. I feel really good about those 5 picks.
I thought maybe you just read another.
I apologize for initially taking Alabama out. And I hesitated on those
Yes.
Texas and Alabama, but I think Alabama makes it, and probably I, I I definitely don't like Michigan making it. I think that Michigan's going to have a big drop off. Um, Penn State, you're right. When I think about Penn State more, I favor it over Michigan. So
Hmm.
am I saying the Big Ten would only have 2 teams in, Ohio State and Oregon? Maybe. I think Penn State's gonna lose its season opener at West Virginia.
Oh wow. Well, if that happens, I don't see a path to playoff for them. If they're losing their opener to West Virginia, forget about it. Do
Well,
you think?
so
Go ahead, John.
I'm just thinking, so who I guess I'm having trouble seeing a 3rd Big Ten team. I don't know who that would be.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't know if you would need one if you think two teams can get in from the ACC, two teams can get in from the Big 12. You've got your five from the SEC. You've got two from the Big 10 in Ohio State and Oregon. Throw your group of five in there. You're up to 8 qualifiers. And then you would need, to round out your field, you would need two from the ACC and two from the Big 12. If you could, if that were to happen, you could have a playoff with just two Big Ten teams. So it's plausible. I mean, I don't think it's stretching the bounds of possibility that the ACC and Big 12 could get 2 qualifiers.
do you think the selection committee, do you think there will be a bias against the ACC and Big 12? Because it's kind of the way this is shaped and the way it's presented it. Oh, the Big Ten and the SEC are super conferences. They've expanded. They've added out all these good programs. They are way above everybody else. It's almost like they've turned the Big 12 and ACC into, uh, other outside the Power Four conferences, so that you look at them differently. But I think when I look at the Big 12, there's so many teams that I could see 2 teams. It's very balanced, but if 2 teams kind of rise above the field, I could see they're both getting in, but I don't know if how the selection committee will look at the Big 12. I think it's going to look down on the Big 12.
Oh, I think it'll look down on the Big 12, and I think to a certain extent it'll look down on the ACC too. I do think, let's say you're the runner up in one of those conferences, the Big 12 or the ACC, and you've lost 2 games and it's to the same team. Like Clemson, for example, could lose to Florida State in the regular season, and then they could lose to Florida State again in the conference championship game. I think the committee might kind of like a team like that. Like if you beat everybody else on your schedule, you beat some ranked opponents. Clemson's not a good example because they played Georgia. They're going to lose to Georgia.
So you
Um,
you basically they're eliminated already unless they
right.
beat Florida State.
Yeah. So they're not a good example. But let's take a team from the Big 12. Um, if you go through the regular season and only lose to one team, and then you were to meet that team again in the conference championship and you were to lose again, I think if the losses were close and if the committee valued that other team from the Big 12, you could have an undefeated conference champion, and the only team you lost to as the runner up was that undefeated team twice. And you have a 10 and or an 11-2 record come selection day. Yeah, I think you could still get in at that point. Where I think those conferences will lose some respect is if they start to get kind of messy and it's not really evident whether there are any elite teams in the conference. I think the better path to getting 2 teams into the playoff from one of those leagues is you have one elite team. You have a team go 13-0 throughout the regular season. They go 12-0 in the regular season. They win the conference championship game. They're 13-0. They're your number one qualifier. I think the best chance to get a second team from the conference would then to be having an 11-2 team whose only 2 losses are to that 13-0 conference champion. I think it gets a little bit messier to getting 2 playoff teams from one of those leagues if everybody's kind of beating up on each other and it's not even real evident if there are any elite teams in that conference. Then I think you might be in a scenario where whoever wins the conference championship is in, and the conversation ends there.
Yeah, I look when I again looking at the Big 12, when I look at some of these schedules, Oklahoma State is a really good program. It's been good for a long time. Won some big games along the way. Another pro, I know Utah's the highest rated team in the preseason poll from that conference. I really like Arizona. It finished the year on a 7-game winning streak. It's got its quarterback and some other key players returning. Arizona, look at its schedule. It doesn't play Oklahoma State. So Oklahoma State and Arizona don't play. If Arizona's toughest game would be at Utah, but it's got, I don't know. I just see it as a chance to do really well at Kansas State could be a challenge. But I could see a team like that. What if it goes? What if it goes 11-1 and it plays? Hypothetically, plays an unbeaten Oklahoma State team in the playoff and wins, and you've got two 11-1 teams from that conference.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I think there's an avenue to 2 from the Big 12, 2 qualifiers. Same with the ACC. I think it would be either of those conferences would be hard pressed to produce 3 qualifiers. I think 2's probably the maximum from those leagues. As you were talking about Arizona, John, it gave me a thought because I think that's interesting. I would include Arizona on my list of playoff contenders because I think the Big 12 is maybe the most wide open conference, and I think they will be in the mix. But I think from each of the power conferences, I can come up with a playoff sleeper, a minimum of one, in every conference except the Big 10. The Big 12, we mentioned Arizona. I think they qualify as a playoff sleeper. In the ACC, I would have Miami and SMU as kind of sleeper picks to win the conference championship. I don't like their odds as much as Florida State or Clemson even, but I think Miami is going to be better this year. They got Cam Ward, the transfer quarterback from Washington State. Maybe Mario Cristobal can get out of his own way and not not cost the team some games. And Miami's preseason number 19. I think that qualifies as a playoff sleeper. So there's one from the ACC. We mentioned Texas A&M as a playoff sleeper from the SEC. I can't come up with a playoff sleeper from the Big Ten. I mean, you got these 4 teams that are ranked inside the top 10: Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, and Penn State. We've got Michigan out. You're kind of on the fence about Penn State. But then as the conversation gets deeper, I don't really consider Southern Cal or Iowa a playoff sleeper. Those are the only other 2 teams from the Big Ten ranked are Southern Cal and Iowa. I think the transition to the Big Ten this year is going to be really tough on Southern Cal. They also have a difficult schedule. I mean, they play LSU in their opener. They lose that game. I don't really see a path to playoff for Southern Cal. They also got Notre Dame on the schedule. So, I think they're going to take some lumps inside the conference and outside the conference. I don't have them as a playoff contender. I don't have Iowa as a playoff contender. So the Big Ten is that conference where I can't come up with a playoff sleeper for them. You got the 4 teams inside the top 10, but I don't think they're going to qualify anybody from the playoff outside of their top 4 teams, and I don't even think they're going to get all 4 because I think Michigan's going to be out.
Well, those Big Ten teams you mentioned, I guess Southern California is a team I always look at as a program rather that can have tremendous talent. That's a team that I think so often underachieves. But in terms of sheer talent, I just think it has talented players. It doesn't always show up on the field. I know it does have a difficult schedule, but man, what if it beats LSU in Las Vegas in that opener?
Yeah, then
I wouldn't
my
pick
perception
it.
might change on them, and they do miss their schedule is tough, but they don't have to play Ohio State and they don't have to play Oregon. So the 2 best teams from the conference, they don't have to play. But I mean, they got LSU, they have Michigan, they have Washington, they have Notre Dame, and they were struggling last year. I mean, you're right. They do have talent and underachieve with it so oftentimes. But I'm thinking like if you're underachieving in the Pac-12, I don't know that your fortune is going to change when you're stepping now into a tougher conference. I mean, Southern Cal went 8-5 last year, and I think to make the playoff, they need to go 10-2. So they're going to transition into a tougher conference. They got a pretty tough schedule, even though it doesn't have Ohio State and Oregon, and they need to get to 10 wins after winning 8 last year. And oh, by the way, Caleb Williams is gone now. I just don't have them on my list of playoff contenders, and I sure don't have Iowa on my list.
Well, I watched Miller Moss throw for about 20 touchdowns when he started for Caleb Williams.
True.
Do you remember who that game was
I think it
against?
was against Louisville in the bowl game. I
Okay,
believe it
didn't
was.
he throw? Was it 6? Did he
He
throw
threw
6?
6 touchdown passes
Yeah, I
against
thought so. I
Louisville.
mean, he looked really good. Southern Cal's defense was atrocious, and that kind of followed uh, Lincoln Riley from Norman, because he had some big offenses and some really small defenses there in Soonerland. So, yeah, Iowa. When you look at Iowa's schedule, you think, man, they could be a playoff contender. But how many times could you have said that about Iowa in the last 10 years? I mean, its schedule, because it played in the Big Ten West, its schedule was never demanding. Um, I look at it now, it plays at Ohio State, and I think it's got a shot in the rest of its games when you look at it on paper. But then, gosh, every time I watch Iowa play, I just think, no, stay away. That's not a team I would bet on unless I'm betting the under.
Yeah, and when you have to win so many games by scoring about 12 points, I just think there's going to be one or two somewhere along the line that, even though they'll be favored in them, they'll find a way to lose. Yeah, you're right. Iowa does have a pretty good schedule draw, but they'll get creamed by Ohio State. If they were to reach the Big 12 championship game, they'd get creamed again, and I think that's probably a hard sell as a,
Well,
as a playoff team.
if you took it took Ohio State and Oregon out of the Big Ten this year.
Uh-huh.
I mean, how good is that conference this year?
It's a great point. You take even one of those teams out of the Big Ten. Let's say you took Ohio State out of the equation.
Mhm.
I'm not sure the Big Ten's that much better than the ACC or the Big 12. Now with all their teams in it, I think you have to say they're better. Um, they're not that much better, but they are better. But if you were to take even one out of the equation, you take Ohio State out, you left Michigan, Oregon, and Penn State in. I don't know. It's a little bit better than the ACC. It's a little bit better than the Big 12, but I don't think it's substantially better.
Well, I mean, I look at Washington playing for the national championship last season. I mean, it lost everybody. Michigan lost a lot, but it didn't lose as much. I mean, it seemed like the entire offensive line transferred. It
Mm-hmm.
lost its head coach. It lost its quarterback, receivers. I mean, it's not a very impressive looking team on paper. Maybe the SEC, a familiar face from the SEC, Will Rogers, will go out there and play quarterback. But my picture of him is, a hard Russian defensive end coming after him. He just can't evade that one pass rusher he needs to evade.
All right, well, we'll have another set of rankings out next week as the AP gets their preseason poll moment in the spotlight next. And we'd like a ranking from you as well, as we're in preseason ranking season. If you like what you've heard, if you like what you hear on SEC Football Unfiltered, we'd appreciate it if you give us a rating or review, or click the subscribe button. Those ratings and reviews help us find more listeners, and we'll be back with you next week. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.